Jayapal erupts, shattering Noem's entire IC shooting narrative on live record, and the moment her voice cut through that hearing room, everything changed. It wasn't slow, it wasn't subtle, it was explosive. One of those political moments where you can physically feel the temperature shift as the truth someone has been avoiding finally gets dragged out into the open. And for the first 30 seconds, something almost eerie happened. Silence. The kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes the story they've been told might not just be incomplete, it might be entirely wrong.
I believe it's the gentlelady from Washington and then the gentlelady from California. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this bill, but I want to go back to what happened in Minnesota, because I just think that this is so critical on so many different levels. There's new information coming out every minute. I'm tracking this very closely. I want to enter into the record an article from the Washington Post entitled, "ICE Agent Was Not in Vehicle's Path When He Fired at Driver." I also want to enter into the record an article from the New York Times that is titled, "Minnesota Officials Say They're Being Blocked from Investigating Fatal ICE Shooting."
Without objection.
And the reason I think this is very important is because we have video footage that is being shown across this country about what happened in Minnesota when Ms. Good was shot 3 times by an ICE agent as her car was being turned to move away. And we also have immediately, not days later, immediately, the Secretary of Homeland Security, who has billions of dollars at her disposal, taxpayer dollars, who has been using ICE agents to kidnap and disappear people across our cities, including US citizens, by the way, mass detention policies that have been ruled illegal by numerous judges across the country with no due process, which is what this committee is supposed to ensure that we have. And that Secretary of Homeland Security, combined with the President of the United States, within hours, put out statements that were absolutely lies. And that's coming out now with all this video footage. And what happens, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, what happens is we live in 2 realities. We here in Congress are living in 2 realities, where we have one reality of what's happening to the American people. Healthcare is being stolen. We're invading Venezuela without authorization from Congress. Congratulations to the Republicans in the Senate who voted for the War Powers resolution where it passed in the Senate on Venezuela. We are seeing a reality on television of an American citizen who was sitting in her car be violently approached by an ICE agent and then turning her car away and being shot 3 times. Not once, not twice, 3 times. When you have the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security now give an alternate reality to what happened, what you do is you undermine any trust that may have existed in the United States government, because that's who's saying these lies. And when you undermine the trust, and maybe this is the proposition that my colleagues across the aisle are okay with, I don't know. But when you undermine that kind of trust in our government, in our democracy, that is when you have lawlessness. And look, this isn't the first time. January 6th happened. I was in that gallery when January 6th happened. I couldn't walk, I had a cane, I just had a knee surgery, and I was one of the last people to be let out of the gallery. And to tell me that that didn't happen, that that was not a violent insurrection incited by the President of the United States, confirmed by a special counsel that he was absolutely trying to steal that election, is not just a disservice. That's too mild of a word. It is fundamentally undermining people's faith in government. Because when I see these articles that say ICE agent was not in the vehicle's path when he fired at the driver, and that is directly contradictory to what the President of the United States has said, how can we accept anything from this government, from this administration? He wants to set up an offshore account for Venezuelan oil that we sell. And I don't know, is he going to control that account? I have no idea. But I am deeply disturbed about this killing, about the lack of accountability from this committee, about the fact that members on the other side are defending this killing. And I think we have to think about the consequences to our democracy and to our judiciary system and to the trust in government. I yield back.
I think I have.
Because Jayapal didn't walk into that hearing to make polite points or trade rehearsed lines. She showed up to detonate a narrative that top officials had pushed within hours of a fatal shooting in Minnesota, a narrative that she said was already collapsing under real evidence. And the way she dismantled it piece by piece was so forceful, so unexpected, that even people who thought they knew what happened suddenly weren't so sure anymore. It all centered on one moment, the killing of Renee Nicole Good. A 37-year-old woman, a Minnesota resident, shot 3 times by an ICE agent in a South Minneapolis neighborhood during what was supposed to be a organized, tightly run enforcement action. And in the first hours after her death, top officials stepped forward to declare the shooting justified. They described Good as a threat. They said her actions forced the agent to use lethal force. They framed the entire incident as a necessary response to danger. But that was before the footage surfaced. Because once the video started appearing online, clip by clip, angle by angle, the cracks in the official story weren't small, they were massive. Viewers could see Good turning her vehicle, trying to move away. They saw the agent approach, then firing. They didn't see the imminent threat that early statements claimed. They didn't see the scenario that had been described to the public with absolute confidence. What they saw instead was confusion, panic, and a decision that raised far more questions than the government had answers. And this is where Jayapal came in, because she wasn't interested in polite questions or gentle suggestions that maybe the administration should clarify things. She was describing what looked to her like a narrative that had been prepared. Before facts were confirmed, a story pushed out to millions of people long before investigators had even collected all available evidence. And she wasn't alone. Reporters from major outlets were already publishing findings that contradicted the earliest official claims. Community leaders in Minneapolis were calling the statements misleading. Local authorities said they were being blocked from conducting their own oversight. So when Jayapal took the microphone, she started with the footage. She described the moment the shots were fired. She reminded her colleagues that Good wasn't driving toward the agent but away. She laid out the reporting line by line, pointing out every detail the administration had gotten wrong. And then she said something that stopped the hearing cold, that within hours of the shooting, while evidence was still being collected, while questions still hung in the air, both the Homeland Security Secretary and the President of the United States had issued statements that she believed were absolutely lies. She didn't cushion it. She didn't soften it. She didn't dance around it. She said it flat. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was destabilizing. Because when a member of Congress accuses top officials of lying about a fatal shooting in the middle of an ongoing investigation, that isn't normal political disagreement. That's a trust crisis. And she framed it exactly that way. We are living in 2 realities, she said, her voice steady, not shaking with anger but sharpened by certainty. One reality, she explained, is what the American people are actually witnessing: healthcare stripped away, questionable military decisions made without congressional authorization, and now, an unarmed woman shot in the middle of a Minneapolis street. The second reality is the version of events described by officials who seem more invested in shaping narratives than revealing facts. This idea of 2 realities is where the script flips, because Jayapal didn't just claim the administration got it wrong. She argued that the rush to present a narrative before evidence was verified has become a pattern, one so dangerous that it now threatens the stability of public trust. She pointed to the administration's history of mass detentions that courts have ruled unlawful. She highlighted ICE practices that have resulted in U.S. citizens being detained, despite procedures meant to prevent that. She referenced the department's long record of due process violations that judges across the country have struck down, calling them unconstitutional. And when she tied these actions to the Minnesota shooting, her message became unmistakably clear: this wasn't a mistake, it was part of a broader trend. A trend where narratives come first, evidence comes later, and accountability comes never. Then she added a comparison that made the entire room shift in their chairs. She mentioned January 6th, not to relitigate it but to show how easily entire groups of people can be convinced that something they saw with their own eyes didn't actually happen. She reminded the committee that she was in the gallery that day. She reminded them she'd just had knee surgery. She reminded them of the fear, the chaos, the reality of that moment. And then she turned the knife. If leaders can convince their supporters that January 6th was not a violent attack, she said, then convincing them of a false narrative about the Minnesota shooting would be even easier. That wasn't a political argument. That was a psychological one. She was pointing out how narratives grow stronger not because they're true, but because they're repeated. How misinformation doesn't need to be accurate, it just needs to be loud. And how powerful officials can use that volume to drown out reality. But the most chilling part of her testimony wasn't the accusation itself, it was the consequence she warned about. When people stop believing the government is capable of telling the truth, they don't just distrust one department or one official, they begin to distrust everything, every institution, every law, every claim, every process. That's when democracy begins to break apart. Not because of one scandal, but because of 1,000 moments like this, moments where people realized they were told one thing when the truth was something else entirely. And Jayapal pushed hard on that point. The danger isn't just the shooting. The danger is what happens when officials create an alternate reality to justify it. It's what happens when leaders choose speed over accuracy, when narrative becomes more important than truth. When officials expect the public to accept the first version of the story without question, because once you accept that version, the real investigation becomes irrelevant. That's why she fought to enter articles into the congressional record, articles that contradicted the administration's early statements, articles that documented the inconsistencies, articles that showed local investigators being shut out of the case. And once those articles were in the record, the narrative couldn't simply fade away. It was documented, archived, cemented. Now the committee couldn't ignore it. Now the administration couldn't pretend no one had noticed. Now the story had to be confronted. What made this moment so explosive is that Jayapal wasn't merely challenging the shooting, she was challenging the entire information pipeline that produced the initial narrative. She questioned why officials spoke so quickly, why they framed the situation so dramatically, why they leaned into the language of terrorism before anyone had reviewed all the footage, why they presented conclusions before they had answers. Because in her view, that rush isn't neutral, it's intentional. It shapes public perception before facts can catch up. It builds a wall of belief that becomes harder to tear down with every hour that passes. And by the time the truth surfaces, half the country has already chosen which reality they want to live in. Jayapal saw that happening in real time. The footage didn't match the statements. The reporting didn't match the narrative. Local officials were saying one thing, federal agencies, another. And as those contradictions piled up, the biggest casualty wasn't the narrative, it was trust. She warned the committee that defending a shooting without verifying facts doesn't just harm a community, it harms the entire country. Because once the public learns they were told something untrue, even unintentionally, suspicion becomes the default. And suspicion, when it spreads far enough, becomes cynicism. And cynicism, if left unchecked, can collapse institutions from within. But Jayapal also pointed out something even more alarming, the weaponization of fear. When government leaders use exaggerated claims to justify aggressive action, whether it's mass detention, military involvement or fatal shootings, they shrink civil liberties for everyone. And once power expands in the name of safety, it almost never contracts again. She argued that this moment wasn't an isolated misstep. It was a test. Could the public be persuaded to accept the official story before the truth emerged? Could the administration get ahead of the narrative and hold it? Or would the footage break through the noise? The answer wasn't fully clear. Millions of people were already entrenched in one version of events or the other, but Jayapal's testimony forced a reset. It yanked the conversation back to ground level, back to the evidence, back to the unanswered questions. She reintroduced doubt, real necessary doubt, into a situation where too many people had been told to stop questioning and start accepting. And that may be the most powerful act of all. She restored the idea that the public deserves the truth, even if it takes time, even if it complicates the narrative, even if it embarrasses those in power. Her eruption wasn't just anger, it was urgency. It was a demand for accountability. It was a reminder that without truth, nothing else works, not law enforcement, not oversight, not democracy, not public safety. Because trust isn't built on speed, it's built on honesty. And without honesty, every system eventually collapses. That's why this hearing struck such a nerve. It exposed how fragile trust has become, how quickly narratives form, and how fiercely reality must be defended. And it left viewers with one unsettling thought: if this narrative didn't match the evidence, how many others don't either? If you want more in-depth breakdowns like this, clear, engaging stories that cut through spin and get to the truth, make sure you hit subscribe, drop a like, and turn on notifications. There's a lot happening behind the scenes in moments like these, and you deserve to know the real story every single time.